Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. I'm Ellen Cravato. I'm the CEO of the New Canaan Library. And so tonight is the kind of night that this library was built for, a riveting discussion which takes us through a window to the present with a glimpse of the past. Tonight we gather under the auspices of the annual William Attwood Memorial Lecture, an endowed series which seeks to honor a longtime New Canaanite, a journalist who traveled, as he said, the chancelleries and mud huts of the world as an editor at Look magazine and eventually as publisher of Newsday. In the course of his career, he also helped shape the causes in which he believed. He served as an aide to Adlai Stevenson, speechwriter for John F. Kennedy, and as U.S. ambassador to Guinea and Kenya at the time of Cold War confrontation on the African continent. At the time of his death in 1991, with the help of family and friends, the library undertook the William Attwood Memorial Lecture with the goal of engaging speakers whose work or interests honor his lifelong interest in journalism, in government, in literature, and politics. Past speakers have included Art Buchwald, Harold Evans, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, David Brooks, John Meacham, Chris Whipple, and Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch, who I had the privilege to interview on the stage a few years ago. This evening, I am delighted to welcome Saad Mohseni, the chairman and CEO of Moby Group, Afghanistan's largest media company. Radio Free Afghanistan is a book which charts the 20-year effort to bring a free press under Taliban rule. Mohseni's unique position as a media entrepreneur in this repressed land lends special insights into the lives and resilience of the Afghan people, especially the women who still work in Moby's offices today. His parents were forced to flee Afghanistan with their 4 young children shortly after the 1978 coup and remained in exile throughout the Soviet occupation in the first Taliban regime. Saad was born in London and grew up mostly in Australia, where he yearned to return to the homeland he remembered from childhood. When the Soviets finally decamped, he took his entrepreneurial spirit to his country in 2002 to bring soap operas and singing competitions, but mostly radio and television news, to a citizenry long starved for truth. The rising importance and influence of Moby afforded Mohseni access to everyone with a stake in Afghanistan's future, from the government of Hamid Karzai to the White House. He brings a unique understanding of the complicated history, politics, cultural diversity in country during the 20-year American occupation and today. Today, there are still hundreds of men and women working in Moby's Kabul office, creating programs, reporting the news, and educating the public, often in defiance of the Taliban. Saad will be joined in conversation this evening with his good friend and Moby board member, Tom Freston, a media and entertainment investor at Firefly 3. He is both former chief executive officer and chief operating officer of Viacom, Inc., one of the founding team at MTV in 1980, he became chairman and CEO of MTV Networks in 1986, where he oversaw MTV, Nickelodeon, VH1, and Comedy Central, and other television and digital businesses over 17 years. Mr. Freston is also board chair of the One Campaign, an advocacy organization that fights extreme poverty. He serves on several boards, including Imagine Entertainment and the think tank New America. He was inducted into the Academy of Television Arts and Sciences Hall of Fame in 2010, and in 2005, Mr. Freston was cited in Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People in the World issue. Please join me in welcoming Tom Freston and Saad Mohseni to our stage.
Well, it's nice to be here, and good evening, everybody. I thought I'd start this off. I did a little calculation today to kind of show the significance of the Afghan war, which ended 3 years ago in August, as we know. But it was America's longest war. It cost, and we lost. And there's many analogies you could draw to Vietnam, how we threw money at a problem, looked the other way as a corrupt government kind of went their own way and undermined the allegiance of their people. But we spent $2 trillion over a course of 20 years, $2 trillion, which amounts to like $275 million a day is what we spent day in and day out for 20 years on this war in Central Asia, which meant you could buy like an $11.5 million house in New Canaan every hour for 20 years. That's how much, we talk about blood and treasure. There's a lot of treasure that went. And, in Vietnam, we lost a war to an insurgency that was in flip-flops, and this one we lost it to, with 50 allies, lost it to an insurgency that was in sandals. So we're obviously not very good at this. So we spent a lot of money. But one place where we did do something right, and a lot happened in that 20-year period. It was like a free bubble in a country that had been locked away for a long time. We invested $230,000 in the private sector to start a radio station that my friend Saad, who's a dear friend now, started it in the wake of the Taliban's, leaving the country in 2004, right? They kind of flipped a switch to a traumatized country that had no music, no kite flying, there was no anything under the Taliban's reign. And all of a sudden, music was coming out of taxi windows and the whole kind of nation turned on again. And he took that $230,000 and started and began and grew a media conglomerate that became the leader not only in Afghanistan, but with businesses in Africa and elsewhere. So it's a good cheer for private enterprise versus spending $11,500 an hour, $11,500,000 an hour. But Saad, why did you write this book? Tell us. It's a great story. It's sort of a page turner. Your background is really kind of unusual. Maybe you want to give us a little bit of backstory. Your father was a diplomat. You were born in London. Then you end up out on the street in Japan, learned Japanese, went to Japanese school. You're a refugee in Japan, and then worked your way to Australia. But somehow something brought you back to your home country. Why don't you talk a little bit about how you got back into business?
Thank you, Tom. Great to be here, and thank you for hosting us. I started writing this book. I thought about writing a book straight after the fall of the government in August of 2021, assuming that they would shut down our businesses. And I thought I should put pen to paper and at least for my own benefit, for the benefit of my children, write this story. And I was always very cognizant of how your kids judge you. I think for most of us, it's the way we define our lives is how they see you. And most of my kids, actually none of my kids had been to Afghanistan. So I started to write this story, and of course Afghanistan didn't fall, but the story sort of came together, and the 20 years were pretty exciting years for us. As media operators and also as Afghans. But to go back to the 1970s, I was born son of an Afghan diplomat. I was a career diplomat. It was posted in Japan, 1978. Late 1979, the Soviets invade Afghanistan. He resigns. We're in limbo for 2 years, and then my father has to decide as to where he's going to go next. America, where he was educated, a difficult country in those days, drugs, unemployment, and so forth. Canada was too cold, and Australia seemed the perfect place to move to, which we did. For a lot of us, we never had closure on what had transpired in Afghanistan, especially for the kids of diplomats. We always felt that we needed to go back, and if we could, to do something. So after 9/11, there was this opportunity to go back and to check the place out, and we did, and we thought, well, why not start a few businesses?
You thought first, let's just get into the almond business.
Yeah, we thought, well, let's invest in a few sectors and let's pool our money, myself and my siblings, and let's see what we can invest in, and go back to Australia, and then just keep traveling back and forth, and we have these passive investments. I went to see the information and culture minister, this eccentric man who used to know my dad in the 70s. He said, why don't you do radio? And I said, well, can we get a license? He said, yeah, why not? This new environment allows you to open this a radio station or a TV station. And electricity was very low in those days. It was like 10% of the population had electricity. So television seemed a little too ambitious. And then I spoke to a friend of mine, this gentleman called Ahmed Rashid, who's a very well-known Pakistani author, wrote the book about the Taliban, and he was having dinner with Andrew Natsios, who was then the head of USAID, and he said, we'd like to help. It was a very small investment of $220,000 to be exact. We put up $350,000 or $400,000, and we set up this radio station, not knowing anything about media or technology or anything. So, and that's how the business got started.
And you love a story about an entrepreneur who doesn't know anything about a business, and it becomes something that has this huge impact, far and above what you ever imagined. But you slept on the floor, and you bought a lot of egg crates to put on the wall and set up a studio. And you had to deal in an environment where nobody had any media experience, because there was no media. It was a media-free country. No radio stations, no television stations, one radio station.
Yeah, and we turned the switch on, and and literally people found out about it. And I was actually away just on a short break, and my brother rang and said, you better get back because the country's going nuts. Not all good, because a lot of people felt it was controversial, women behind the microphone, pop music, all the stuff that you probably experienced at MTV. And so I got back quickly, and then we had to navigate this very challenging environment. and hasn't stopped.
Well, that led to television. One of the interesting things was part of the mission of Moby was to sort of see if they could be more purposeful in what they do and promote things like gender equality, things that were really missing from Afghanistan. The desire to have girls in school, family size, optimal family size, and so forth. And just having a man and a woman together on a radio station was a big deal. But nobody, while the authorities cared, the real people didn't seem to mind at all. Correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think also you sometimes have to, you have to push the envelope. You know, like we're having men and women on, you know, having a chit, you know, just having a casual conversation was, I think, initially a bit jarring even for the ordinary Afghans. But if you persist with it, and that's how you, I suppose, you facilitate social change. I mean, we didn't have an agenda to do anything. Our agenda was to have a very popular radio station, and I mean, of course, people want to listen to a male as well as a female DJ. Of course, people want to hear people having fun, laughing, getting updated on news and weather, and you know, listening to the best music. It's common sense. But you know, as you know, there are a lot of people who are enemies of fun in a place like Afghanistan, and to navigate that was quite challenging. I mean, we had to be quite daring.
I noticed over the years, I spent a lot of time. I lived in Afghanistan in the 70s, and Saad sort of brought me back in 2007. I felt like Rip Van Winkle. Because I left in 78, there was a communist coup, and that was like a Jenga, pulling out a block on a Jenga structure, and everything fell apart, and they had like 30 years of war pretty much before, a series of wars, where things really fell apart, and you showed up, and this traumatized population with a lot of pent-up desire for just some joy and fun, and you really tapped into that and electrified the country.
I mean, for those of you who don't know much about Tom lived there in the 70s, had a very successful clothing business, and he was forced out by the Soviet occupation as well. We both suffered because of the Soviet occupation. But it was very important for us because we had lived with the stories of our parents about Afghanistan. But I sort of rediscovered Afghanistan also through Tom's stories. It was actually comforting to hear Tom also talk about the good old days, the 1970s, which you have so many fond memories of. It sort of gave us hope that, you know, this country, which was quite liberal in a sort of a Sufi, mystical way in the 70s, had been completely transformed by the Soviet occupation and the billions that went into that country to radicalize it, to impose...
From the Saudis.
From the Saudis, from the Americans, from others. Put billions of dollars in terms of indoctrinating these young kids in madrasas to make them more extreme, because religion was used to motivate kids to fight the Soviets, encouraged hundreds or thousands of foreign fighters, including the likes of bin Laden. So the entire country and then the region became radicalized over that period. But to listen to Tom, it was comforting that there was a time when the country was quite...
There wasn't a lot of tourists then, but the airline they had, their slogan was, "Visit Afghanistan and see the world's friendliest people," which would be these days was the last thing that would come to mind for most people. But if you lived there then, you would have believed that. They had a 50-year period of peace, and it just fell apart in like a medieval way. But in the middle of all of this, here you are, you're building a television network. They're trying to arrest you. Because I remember the first time I went back, he said, "Well, I'll go with you from Dubai." And he tells me when we're on the plane, "Listen, when we're gonna land in Dubai, I'm probably gonna be arrested. But don't let that throw you." I'm going, all right.
I have never seen Tom and his friends so excited. They had the cameras out. I'm serious. And then I'm like, this is a bit weird. But luckily, I was not arrested on that particular day. But we have been arrested many times, and so have our employees. And it's a difficult place to work out of. And I'm sure there are a lot of other places, and we've been to many of these other difficult places.
I don't think, you know, as an entrepreneur, you could find a more difficult environment than the one you picked. And the fact that you were able to bob and weave your way through it with your team is pretty amazing. But you developed a lot of enemies along the way. Saad was on the enemies list from the Iranians, the Pakistanis, the Taliban, and most of the members of the Afghan government.
Yeah.
We're not fans.
Well, if people like you, you're not doing a good job, I suppose. we were in the news business, we were in the entertainment business, so it was natural, inevitable that you would make enemies. But I think you just focus on what you need to do. You make compromises along the way. I don't think.
Well, I remember I was on the board for many years of Asian Society. We had Karzai came in to speak, and I was going to introduce him. This must have been, I don't know, 2010 or something. And I was talking to him sort of backstage, and I said, well, I was working with Saad Mohseni and Talo TV and whatnot. He goes, Saad Mohseni, he's a bad man. He's not a good man. He loves the Taliban. And I go, well, I don't think that's the case, but there's the head of the state.
Well, we sort of became friends after that. But over the years, we've patched our differences up, and I keep in contact with him. He's in Kabul, Afghanistan, and you have to let you have to move on. I think you have to be very forgiving, working in environments that we.
Well, we've moved on after spending $2 trillion, and I'm wondering, from your perspective now, what could America have done differently, where we might have had a different outcome? How did we approach the situation after we displaced the Taliban? What were some of the primary errors?
Well, I think it's important to point out that the Afghan nation, the 20 years of world engagement was transformative for the country and its people. Tax dollars actually impacted things on the ground in a really positive way. And if you look at every benchmark, every data or statistic, people are better educated, they have better health, they live longer, there's infrastructure. Perhaps the most transformative 2 decades of, in the country's recent history. So that's a positive. And I think a lot of people, the assumption is, well, the government was corrupt. They eventually prevailed. Let's forget about Afghanistan. I think it's important to note that the country really did change in a positive way. And we talked about this in the car, that the Taliban's approval rating was always low. It was about 15 or 16%. But the government's approval rating was also very low. It was around 17%. So the Afghan public really, they were never really consulted. We had elections, but there was no justice. The government's corrupt, the judiciary is corrupt, parliament's corrupt. And as a matter of fact, the media played the role of all of the above. People, if they had problems, they would come to the media rather than to go to, they would, rather than going to the police or the prosecution, they would always come to the media organizations. And there are plenty of media organizations. We were one of many. We dominated, but there were like 70, 80 TV stations and hundreds of radio stations. So I think it's important. I mean, nation building is not your forte as a nation. And as we've seen, the Americans effectively fought 20 different wars 1 year at a time. There was no clear strategy. They were just basically it's sort of a tactical approach in terms of, let's just, a commander would come and command for 12 months. A diplomat would come and his tenure wouldn't go beyond 2 years. And then back in Washington, it was just about, let's just keep things going and just hope for the best. So I think if people had thought about a 20-year project, they would have planned it very, very differently.
Well, at the end of 2002, when Rumsfeld was Secretary of Defense, the Taliban, who were in a really weakened position and had been routed, came to the government and said, we'd like to be part of the new government. We'd like to be part of a coalition government, which is normally what happens after a civil war. All the parties kind of get together and work it out, and somehow things change. But Rumsfeld turned down that opportunity, I think, once or twice. We don't negotiate with terrorists. And so we went on with a war for another 18 years.
Yeah, and
could have ended it right there.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing is that America chose, and the international community they chose the wrong partners. The most corrupt, inept, predatory types were chosen as partners. It's the equivalent of, your plane landing in some obscure African town, and as you emerge from the airport, some guy comes and says, I can help you with a taxi, I can help you with a hotel, I can help you with all of the above. And without you checking anything, you go with that guy. And effectively, that's what happened with the American government. They just went for the guys who were willing to do anything for them, except they were the worst types. And the reason, it's the old adage that oppositions don't win, governments lose. And I mean, in Afghanistan, you know, defeat was snatched from the jaws of victory, as we saw.
Well, it was really the independent media, which was enshrined in the Afghan constitution and was rated the freest media in the region. We're really the only people with the white hats throughout this whole process. I was going to mention Dexter Filkins, who's a friend of ours, but also he was the guy who wrote Forever War, kind of coined that piece of language. He said that Saad did more to change Afghanistan than any single person, more than all the diplomats and soldiers combined, which is, you know, quite a quote. So that investment that we made at Moby early on really sort of paid off.
He would say that because he's a friend of ours, right?
Well, no. There's a lot of truth to that. There's a lot of truth to, because in that 20-year period, minds were opened. All of a sudden, women went to school. They became parliamentarians. They became judges. And, you know, schools opened and the literacy rates went up. And as you said, a lot of metrics on, you know, health went, you know, sky high, roads were built, and now it's all kind of screeched to a halt.
Sort of.
Well, sort of. I mean, I want to read something that came up today in the news. You know, we've known the Taliban have taken over, but today they have banned women, as if the bar can't get any lower. They've banned women from hearing other women's voices in public. So Afghan women are effectively banned from holding conversations with one another, like in a mosque or any other public place. When an adult female prays and another female passes by, she must not pray loudly for them to hear. That's the new mindset that you're dealing with. And I know that there's factions within the Taliban that are more liberal, hard as that may be to believe, but
pragmatic, I would say.
Pragmatic. How have you been able to stay on the air? You've lost all your advertisers but one. Well, and you've changed your business model.
Yeah. Well, I mean, first and foremost, we had to make a decision. Do we stay or do we leave? And the reason why we stayed, we felt that to have that presence on the ground, we would be able to continue to report on issues, provide some forms of entertainment, and more important than anything, be able to sort of contribute to education programs and so forth. And of course also get information out of Afghanistan for the international audiences. But in reality, the situation on the ground is a lot more nuanced than what you would read about. Women continue to work for us and others, for NGOs.
What percentage of your workforce is female?
Well, I mean, it's 30%. It's been consistently 30%. As a matter of fact, we've hired more women in our news department since 2021. We had 8 women, and now we have 21 women. In front of the camera, on the field, behind the camera. Yes, they have to wear a surgical mask. They have to cover their faces.
So basically, you just see their eyes now.
Yes. Yes. And we put it to them, would you like to continue or would you like to stop? And they said, we'd like to continue. You know, we just did a survey for the HR department. Our women are a lot more positive and therefore resilient than their male counterparts, which is quite interesting.
Than their American counterparts?
No, they're male.
Oh, male counterparts.
Counterparts. But you can't take anything for granted. I mean, for now, we can operate, but we do have contingency plans and we do have operations outside that we beam into the country. What's important is that Afghans continue to consume media, whether it's entertainment programs or news or current affairs programs or chat shows or game shows or cooking shows. They're still consuming a fair amount of content every single day, which is important.
What were some of the things you had to take off the air?
We had to take off music, and we had to take off soap operas.
And on the news front, any international news?
No, there's a lot of international news. We show people's faces uncovered. Could be a female prime minister or someone on the news, or Malala or someone. We can show their faces uncensored. We are sort of that canary in the coal mine. So as long as we can continue, and I don't take anything for granted, there's still some freedom. And the situation, as I mentioned, is not nuanced. In the cities and major towns, women can go about their business, their faces uncovered, women can drive. When you land in Kabul airport, there's a female immigration officer who stamps your passport. These things continue for now. Even with NGOs, they were banned from, Afghan women were banned from working for NGOs in the UN. NGOs went and negotiated their female employees, like the Norwegian Refugee Committee, NRC, and Jan Egeland, who's the president, told me that in Kandahar, which is the sort of ground zero of the Taliban, he was able to negotiate their female employees going back to work. So it's not that. By the way, we're if you look at the chart, it looks pretty bad. It's deteriorating on a daily basis. But for now, at least, there are some freedoms, which is the reason why myself and others, we talk about how the world needs to remain engaged in Afghanistan. You cannot abandon Afghanistan because the gains of the last 20 years, if we're able to sustain them or keep them alive, there has to be a level of engagement with the country.
Well, so far, no country really recognizes Afghanistan.
No. Well, there's pseudo-recognition in terms of they have an embassy, they don't call them an ambassador. People go and visit. The Americans have a relationship with the Taliban, especially when it comes to ISIS, for example, and other radical groups. The Germans and other Europeans have a relationship with the Taliban because they have to send refugees back to Afghanistan. And the regional countries have to have a relationship because Afghanistan is an important country, can cause trouble for them. Vis-a-vis terrorism, refugees, drugs, and so forth. So there are these relationships. We don't have a formal, the country's not formally recognized, but people do have relationships.
Now, you talk to the Taliban all the time.
I do.
How do they feel about the fact that they've basically been ignored or decried by every government on the planet?
They sort of feel unloved. Because they're saying, well, I'm half joking. What they say is that we made sacrifices over the last 20 years. We lost siblings, family members. We lost our fellow fighters. And today we want to open a new chapter with the Americans, and we're being ignored. And when you point out that fundamental issues like women's rights are not respected, for example, their line is that those things will get resolved over time, and the Western countries need to be more patient. But the problem in Afghanistan is that it's not a monolithic movement. There are different identities, and there was a New York Times profile of Sirajuddin Haqqani, the head of the Haqqani network, who did.
I used to think they were a TV network in and of themselves, but they were the most violent branch of the Taliban, and now they're the liberals.
Yeah, and they're the most pragmatic movement within the Taliban. And we know them well because they killed 7 of our employees in a targeted attack. We sat and I've talked to them. And in Afghanistan, it's important to consider the future rather than look at the past. And we've had some very honest discussions with them in terms of what they've lost and what we've lost. Are they the best hope for the country? I'm not sure, but people should read that profile.
Well, they don't have the support of more than 15–20% of the country, and yet they've set up a government that's totally not inclusive at all. It only includes Pashtun, Taliban-type people.
Yeah, but there are not many other places in the Middle East or Central Asia where the public has a say in terms of who governs them and how they're governed. Well, that's what I think we have to not forget.
What would you change in the U.S. policy now towards Afghanistan?
I think for the American administration, and there's an opportunity to reset this relationship, because I think the Biden administration was so traumatized by the sight of people falling off airplanes. They should re-engage, but the objective should be: can we create a roadmap that would lead to eventual recognition if certain things are abided by, including inclusivity and women's rights. But there has to be a roadmap.
Would you go back?
I'd only go back if things like women's education and women's rights and inclusivity are addressed. But for now, I'll be used as a propaganda tool. They'll parade me around saying that he's come back to kiss the ring.
Now, it's interesting, they've sort of changed their business model, which was, they had well over 100 advertisers, and it was a booming business in Afghanistan between the three. They had an all-news network. They had a network in Dari and a network in Pashto, the two main languages in the country. And they had a host of international and local advertisers. I mean, a real consumer economy was developing. After the Taliban came, I think you were down to one advertiser, like a Red Bull kind of drink. That was it.
No, we have more than one. But yeah, Afghans are the largest, the biggest consumers of energy drinks in the world per capita.
Are they? Because they don't have any booze, you know?
Yeah, one of my guys has 8 cans of whatever the equivalent is of Red Bull every afternoon.
Well, there's a lot of high blood pressure. But you've changed the business model to now produce large volumes of educational programming targeted for girls who can't go to school after 6th grade. And you've got people like the Gates Foundation and Malala Foundation and others to fund this. It's a whole new business model for you. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the idea was, how to create programming that would actually, well, nothing replaces schools, right? Because you don't just go to school to learn. It's important for kids to be able to see each other and to communicate and just develop social skills. But we thought we had to do something in terms of education, and so girls are not allowed to go to school beyond grade 6, which in your country is middle school and high school. So we had to create programs that they could at least, we was going to be a bridge between today, when schools are banned, and the day when schools reopen. So we felt, well, let's find 4 subjects which are not controversial: mathematics, physics, chemistry, and biology, for these 3 grades, 7th, 8th, and 9th grades, in 2 languages. And we worked with NYU, which weirdly has a group of Afghan academics or Afghan education specialists. And the findings are just extraordinary. I mean, UNICEF, which is our partners, they're completely shocked by the findings. Like, for example, just to give you an example, if you don't watch TV, you score 25–30% in mathematics. If you watch television, these programs, you score 55%. But if you are tutored via WhatsApp groups, and we have a group of girls who are tutored, their score goes up to 75%. And it's available online, but television is the most effective way and cheapest way to get these programs into people's homes. Now we're working with to use an AI chat box, for example, to help these kids. But UNICEF told us that they've never seen anything like this in terms of the impact on these young kids. So now we're trying to expand it to grades 10, 11, and 12, more subjects, and we're also doing what we call them cram courses that we can cram for the for the final exams, your equivalent of
for their SATs.
For the equivalent of SATs, because we think if we can actually prepare girls for the final exam, even if they haven't been to school for 2 or 3 years, when universities reopen, or even regional universities, they'd be able to get in. So that gives them at least hope that there's a path to a tertiary education, even if they have not completed high school.
Now, you're probably the most optimistic person I've ever met, because no one would take this line of work upon themselves unless you were.
What choice do we have?
And well, there's plenty of choices. But you keep talking now about when the schools reopen and when the universities reopen. When do you think that's going to happen? Is that really going to happen?
Well, you and I have talked about this. The genie, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. There's population.
The toothpaste out of the tube and all that.
Yeah, that's something like that. So Afghanistan's population is 43 million, right? It's doubled in size since 2021, 2001. So half the population was not even born during, around the 9/11 time. And Afghan population is growing at 3% per annum. And it's still one of the youngest, I think it's the youngest country outside of Sub-Saharan Africa.
Like 18 years old is the median age. Half the people are under 18.
Yeah. So something has to give. The Taliban, you cannot impose these draconian laws on a nation that it's, and you know, we sort of joke about this. I mean, they're attempting to change Afghanistan, but the new Afghanistan is also changing the Taliban in terms of their conduct, the way they dress, the way they behave with members of the
There was an article in the New York Times where they talked to a lot of Taliban fighters who are then working in the offices, and they're bored to death. They miss being out fighting in the boondocks and stuck in an office like a lot of us.
I mean, but there is that risk that these radicalized young men, unemployed, could be unleashed on the region or the world. And I think one of the problems now is, and you know, we've had these discussions in Washington and beyond, is that if you look at Gaza and you look at Lebanon, the decapitation of Hezbollah and Hamas would open, you know, a space for a group as radical and extreme as ISIS. And especially the Afghan ISIS chapter, which is Daesh Khorasan, is
well, that sort of happened in Afghanistan because we went through the years of these night raids where we would decapitate and take out all these major Taliban commanders, but the younger people under them coming up were even more radical.
Yeah, I mean, the problem right now is that Taliban leaders will tell you is that we don't want young girls to go back to school, because if they do, our fighters will be even further radicalized. We'll go to another group that's more extreme than us.
They'll be further radicalized because of their disgust of the idea of girls actually going to school.
Yes. I mean, I don't know the answer to this, but you know, trying to figure out
that's hard stuff.
This misogyny, where does it come from? And I think it's partly because, and I'm going to play the role of an amateur therapist here, but these kids are sent to these madrasas because the families cannot afford them. So they go to these religious schools and taught how to, you know, interpret Islam in the most extreme form. More often than not, they're abused sexually. And then they're sent out at age 12, 13, or 14 to either commit suicide or to fight. So there's a whole generation of these kids. I mean, our friend Barney Rubin was once asked, how many fighters does the Taliban have? And he said, they have enough. There was a waiting line for suicide bombers in the years that the Americans are there. So, you know, so that's why engagement's important, because I think some of the more pragmatic types who do want this thing to end, you know, can't, because I think if you ignore Afghanistan at your own peril, or any of these countries.
Well,
on that positive note,
I would just say I experienced in what they old-timers would call the Golden Age, which was 50 years of peace. It was a beautiful country. It was like 11 million people when I lived there in the 70s, and breathtaking vistas, and the Afghan people had the greatest sense of humor, got along with each other. And it's just gotten worse and worse, and this misogyny thing is sort of the capstone of it all.
It's a very small percentage of the population, but you know, there are enough of them, basically. But the Afghans are still very friendly, and you know, friends of ours, you know, who go and visit foreigners, and they're still moved by
the world's friendliest people.
World's friendliest people.
On that note, why don't we turn it over to the audience for some questions?
If anyone has a question, can you just raise your hand? I'll come to you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm retired now, but as a journalist, I've been to Afghanistan 3 times. The latest was 2010. And I was there in March of 1980, 3 months after the Soviets invaded. Anyway, I'm interested to know, how is there censorship on your news broadcasts? And how precarious is the day-to-day operation of your television station and your radio stations?
Yes, there's no censorship, but we obviously self-censor. So in terms of the news, there's no story that we would not cover. But certain stories we would cover with less fanfare than we would have. In terms of music and soap operas, we were told from day one, you cannot have any of this sort of content. And we cannot, for example, talk about the leader Haibatullah. Of course, he has a declaration we would need to cover. But in terms of criticism of the way that he reigns over the country, for example, those sorts of things, we've got to be careful. But it's, I had this debate in India, and there was a gentleman from India who was giving me a lecture, and I said, ironically, I think in a weird way, we have more freedom as a media operator in Kabul than some of the Indian outlets who are very afraid of criticizing Modi, for example. So there's not as much freedom as, say, pre-2021, but enough to, we have our red lines. I mean, I think we're still comfortable being there, at least for now.
Bibi, let me ask you, when we went into Afghanistan, we had my cousin was a Marine officer, and he said the poppy fields were everywhere in Afghanistan. I've kind of correlated Afghanistan and then with our opiate epidemic here in America. Is the Taliban still pumping heroin from poppy fields from Afghanistan, or is that abolished now with the new government?
Well, weirdly, they banned it, and the ban has remained in place. Tom and I met with the ambassador, Bill Wood, known as Chemical Bill, because he did something similar in Colombia, where he basically attempted to eradicate, and failed. And I think the Americans and the Afghans, billions of dollars spent, they failed. But the Taliban have managed to put a ban in place, which has remained in place for now, at least.
But there was no real history of opium or heroin addiction in Afghanistan prior to the wars. It's now leaked into the population. They produce 90% of the world's heroin. There's 3 million addicts, domestic addicts. So they, like us, they have a huge problem themselves. You go under a bridge and you see people just smoking heroin.
Hi, Saad. How are you? I have a question regarding cultural imperialism on the part of the Wahhabi Saudis. Because from my perspective, as an Afghan American, and my parents, living in Afghanistan in the golden years you're all talking about, it's the Saudi Wahhabi eradication of Afghan culture, especially women's culture, because we're not Arab. We are either, the 4 ethnic groups, we're either Hazara, Uzbek, Farsi speakers, the Tajiks, and the Pashtuns. I personally think it is to get rid of our culture, the way we dress, the way we speak, and whatever that Wahhabi exporting of that. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because I think that's really, because we're stuck between the Wahhabi and the Pakistanis. And I think that is really the issue when it comes to getting rid of our culture. Thank you.
Well, the world succeeded in, I wouldn't say the Afghan war was the reason why the Soviet Empire broke up, but it played a significant role. But the Afghans paid a very heavy price. 7 million refugees, 1 million Afghan dead, 1 million Afghans were handicapped. The biggest damage was what you just mentioned, the radicalization of not just Afghanistan, but Pakistan and the entire region.
We funded, of the 7 Mujahideen groups in the Soviet war, the Pakistanis funneled all our money to the most extreme Wahhabi-oriented groups who really infect Afghanistan with that sort of poisonous culture which totally was alien.
But Afghans have, the 20 years breathing space, that 20 years that we had that space to work on our own, music and poetry and writing and so forth. Has changed Afghanistan. Of course, there are always elements of Wahhabi types. You talk to some of these Afghan Taliban religious leaders, and you say, listen, the rest of the Islamic world doesn't believe in it. They said, what they say is they're wrong and we're right. They're very confident in their interpretation. This is the irony is that Saudi Arabia is opening up, but what they exported to the rest of the region, it's going to take us a long time to recover.
Following up on the last question, I had the impression that perhaps 30 years ago, Afghanistan was a very decentralized, perhaps tribalized territory. And I'm getting the impression it's become more centralized. What are the forces that may have made it more centralized, and what has that done to the culture?
Well, I think one of the reasons the Americans failed was because they supported a very centralized system under the leadership of Hamid Karzai. They created a system that was suited Karzai rather than the other way around. And that very centralized approach to Afghanistan, which you rightly pointed out, in your days, the regions were sort of left alone. I think is one of the reasons why the experiment failed. In a place like Afghanistan or Iraq or so many other countries, I think it's important to empower local authorities and to devolve power to the provinces and the districts. And I think that was a huge failure. Well, culture is something you cannot control. It always evolves, right? And but mass media, I mean, we played our role in making, certain music more popular, clothing and so forth. That cannot be stopped. In this sort of this world of internet and satellite television, you can't stop it. And we have sadly lost a lot of our local traditions, clothing, food, music and so forth, over the last 20 years. Maybe we're partly responsible for that, but that's inevitable. No one can stop that.
I had been working in Albania, Afghan families and individuals directly from November 2021 to October 2023. And what is your position on the new Afghan coming to the United States?
We were in your country. Tom and I went there and we visited with Prime Minister
Eddie Rama.
Eddie Rama, to thank him partly for helping the Afghans. And a lot of my employees actually ended up in, not in Tirana, but well, this is the sad irony, is that we half joke with people that you left the country, you did a deal with the Taliban, effectively giving the country to the Taliban without asking the Afghans. You leave abruptly, there's mayhem. And then you take our best people. Listen, if people want to leave, they should be entitled to leave. And most of these people qualify under the SIV program or the P2 program. But for Afghanistan, it's devastating because we have lost and we're losing our best people. The very people who could lead the country, can transform the country, qualify for these programs so they can leave. And many, many more will leave because the situation on the ground is very difficult.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two. Saad, we were asked if you could hold the microphone closer because some people are having a hard time hearing.
Yes, I recently returned from Turkey, spoke to a lot of young people in Turkey are opposed to Erdogan. And what you're seeing, or at least what I observed in Turkey, is a generational dispute. The younger generation is more secular, European, whereas the older generation in Turkey are more Islamic. And I was just wondering what your opinion is in terms of Afghanistan. Do you think it's a big part of the problem is a generational issue, and that it will take a number of years for the younger generation to come forward and sort of make reform?
Well, in Afghanistan, we've had the issue of rural versus urban divide, where people living in villages and towns are far more conservative. But the radicalization in Afghanistan had a lot of local issues impacted how kids are radicalized. Like in a small village, you have a very predatory village elder supported by the government, supported by the Americans. He goes and raids people's homes, marries one of the daughters, steals from them, and then people turn against that individual and blame the Americans, blames the Afghan government. And those kids his children are radicalized. So you have you have instances of that in terms of why kids are radicalized in a place like Afghanistan. But also, I think every generation does the opposite of their parents. You see that with diaspora Afghans, where their parents were fairly secular, but their kids are pretty radical and quite religious. So I think that in Afghanistan is also true, that the kids of secular Afghans are sort of sometimes more pious than their parents. But I think I don't want to make it very simplistic. I think religion is one thing in a place like Afghanistan. It is so ingrained. When will we have our period of enlightenment? I'm not too sure. I think we have to accept. We tried very hard while running our operations, expose Afghans to different things and to at least attempt to separate religion from affairs of the state. It's very difficult. And I think in some ways we have to work with what are the norms in terms of culture and religion and social conventions. I think it's a little naive. Even in a place like Turkey, I think it's going to be a lot more challenging than, they're a secular state officially, but I think people in Turkey are still fairly conservative. Even in Iran, I think in northern Tehran, yes, they're very secular. In Istanbul, they're very secular. But if you look at Anatolia, or if you look at cities outside of Tehran, you'll find that people are more conservative than you think. They may not like the Ayatollahs, or they may not like the government, but they're fairly conservative.
Okay, before our last question, I just want to remind everyone that Elm Street Books is here with copies of Radio Free Afghanistan for signing.
Thank you. This was fascinating. I wonder if you could say a couple of words about the economy. It appears to be, at least from what we can tell from the news here, great deprivation compared even to the recent past. Who, if anybody, has taken the place of the Americans in providing external support or money for weapons even? What is coming into Afghanistan, and how is Afghanistan doing?
It's an important question. One of the reasons we're in trouble is because the economy tanked by like 40%, because the international money was, much of it went outside to contractors and others and paying for US troops. But a lot of it did filter down. That hit has been felt in Afghanistan. Half the country doesn't have food security. So 22 million people. We still have a lot of internally displaced refugees. In terms of, a third of the country doesn't have proper housing. We're always exposed to the elements because we have extreme cold temperatures and very hot temperatures in the south. So we're very vulnerable. The economy right now, I still think the GDP is around 20 billion. Remittances account for maybe 15% of that. The world is still pumping about $2 billion into the country through its humanitarian assistance, through the World Food Program, through other NGOs. So that's sort of helping things along. The Taliban are collecting taxes. They're actually collecting as much money as the previous government. So that tells you how corrupt the previous government was, which is about $2.5 billion. Sort of more responsible in terms of governing and in terms of collecting taxes. But the country of $20 billion GDP for a country of 42 million people it's not a lot of money. And to answer your other question, no one is stepping in. Not the Chinese, not the Russians, not the Iranians, not the Pakistanis, not the Gulf countries, no one.
Saad Mohseni, Tom Freston, thank you so much for being here.